Well, again, as we speak, Israeli kinetic action is ongoing in Iran. Here to discuss the strategy of the Israelis, what they're trying to do, is Mark Dubowitz of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Mark, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
So, Mark, looking at the progression of the Israeli attacks, the Iranian response, what do you make of the state of play in the Middle East right now? Obviously, Israel's original strikes are sort of shocking in their success. The Iranian counterattack, some of the missiles escaped the missile defense systems. So far, I believe there are 41 injuries, a couple of people critical condition in Israel. What do you think of what's happened so far?
Well, I think it's been an extraordinary 24 hours, certainly for the Israelis. And I think they've exceeded once again the expectations. I always said to people that if the Israelis don't surprise you, they lose. If they surprise you, then they really are doing something extraordinary. And like they did against Hezbollah with the beepers and against Nasrallah and against the whole leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas, I think they've once again really surprised us with remarkable capabilities, training, intelligence, dominance. And so far, so good.
So looking at the amount of damage that Israel has done, we've seen some mixed reports about the damage to the nuclear reactor in Natanz. Obviously, there's been bombing of Fordow. There were serious questions that were raised about the Israeli capacity to seriously damage these institutions. Obviously, we've only seen day one. Israel is planning at least a 7-day barrage here. You would imagine maybe up to 14 days is what they've announced. And what do you make of the Israeli capability to do serious damage to some of these underground facilities?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like they've destroyed Natanz. They've begun to start bombing Fordow, much more difficult, buried underground, 60, 70 meters, hardened with concrete. They can do some damage. Obviously, they need 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators, which is what the United States has, and we have B-2 bombers, and they don't. So I think it's going to be more difficult operation. They started bombing Isfahan, which is an important conversion facility. But Ben, what's a really important story that I think a lot of people are missing is that they went after 12 nuclear weapons scientists. I mean, basically the Robert Oppenheimer and the key physicists of the nuclear weapons program. They've killed 9 of them, and we're waiting to see the sort of battle damage assessment on the other 3. But that is really remarkable because that is the key missing part of a deliverable nuclear weapon, right? The Iranians have enriched material, they have missiles, but they haven't yet been able to build a warhead or even a crude nuclear device. Well, this is the team of the top 12 most important nuclear weapons scientists who would build that warhead. And if 9 of the 12 are dead or 11 of the 12 are dead, that's a devastating blow to Iran's nuclear weapons program.
Now, Mark, the Iranians obviously fired about 100 missiles at Israel over the course of the last few hours. The vast majority of them were shot down. I believe 93 out of 100 were shot down, 7 landed. Again, there are some dozens of injuries inside Israel. What do you make of the Iranian responsive capacity? What do you expect from Iran? How much are they going to escalate? And what are the risks for them in escalation? Because obviously Israel has not yet touched the Ayatollahs or the oil fields in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, it does worry me. They've got a massive inventory of ballistic missiles, 2,000 to 3,000 ballistic missiles. So they have pretty extraordinary firepower. And then they've got cruise missiles and drones. They could do a lot of damage to Israel. Now, obviously, the Israeli Air Force went in there with Mossad and it started to do significant damage to both the inventory and the production capability. They also have to be very careful, as you acknowledge, that if they're going to do damage to Israel, Israel can start to really escalate and go after significant leadership assets, including Khamenei himself. Also, this is where the U.S. role becomes really important because President Trump needs to message to Khamenei that he will not tolerate a response above a certain threshold against Israel and also against the United States. And if he does, that could trigger a devastating U.S. response. And it's the credibility of a U.S. response that's more important than if Trump actually does it. It's the more credible it is, the more likely that Khamenei will be very careful because he knows the only force on God's earth that can bring down his regime is the United States military.
So, Mark, what do you think at this point is the possibility that the Iranian regime actually falls? We've seen unexpected things happening in the Middle East, including, of course, the fall of the Assad regime after decades in power, thanks to the complete hollowing out of Hezbollah. There's a lot of speculation. The Iranian people do not like the Iranian regime at all. The Iranians have shut down their internet internally, so they do not want people obviously coordinating across Iran in the face of these Israeli attacks. Now, how real is the possibility that the Iranian regime collapses or that the Iranian people do something about it? Because it does not look like a regime change is going to be forced from the outside.
Well, I think it can be both. I mean, I certainly think that the Israelis taking out leadership assets starting to go after the security apparatus of the regime, which, by the way, has two purposes. One is for external aggression and one is for internal repression. So you start to remove or to weaken or distract or undermine that internal repression apparatus. Then you give space for Iranians to come back to the streets. And Ben, as you know, they've been on the streets since 2009, millions of Iranians, multiple rounds, yelling death to the dictator, President Biden, Obama, Trump, are you with us or the dictator? Well, the Israelis have now made weakening the regime, undermining the regime, and potentially toppling the regime a central pillar of their Iran strategy. So pressure from the outside, maximum support for Iranians on the inside. This is the Reagan strategy. This is what Reagan did successfully against the Soviet Union. I'm not going to predict the collapse of the Islamic Republic anytime soon, but I am old enough to have lived through the Cold War and the Reagan strategy. And it was a matter of 7-8 years under Reagan where that strategy led to the collapse of the USSR.
So, Mark, obviously, you see some people who I would consider to be foreign policy, either ignoramuses or alarmists, who are suggesting this is going to escalate into a much larger, broader regional war, or indeed World War III. I have a hard time seeing exactly how that would happen. And the fact is that the Iranian regime is at an all-time low in terms of its capacity, its military capacity, its ability to project force. Its octopus tentacles have been essentially severed by the Israelis over the course of the last year and a half. There's no cavalry coming for the Iranians. The Russians are not going to step in and help the Iranians. The Chinese are not going to step in and help the Iranians. They're essentially on their own here. So what do you make of people who are claiming that this is going to spiral out into a broader regional war that will, quote unquote, suck in the United States, or that it will turn into World War III?
I actually think those people are making war more likely, not less likely, because what they're trying to do is undercut U.S. military credibility. If they undercut U.S. military credibility, that means the Iranians think they can escalate without paying a price. If they think they can escalate without paying a price, they're more likely to do things that are going to actually create a broader regional conflict. They may engage in attacks against U.S. forces, against our Gulf allies, terrorist attacks, not only in the region, but maybe in the United States. Again, it's so important that Khamenei understands that he cannot go above a certain threshold. And if he does, the wrath of Donald Trump and the U.S. military will come upon him. But that crowd is making the argument, is really trying to weaken Trump, weaken his leverage, and weaken American military credibility. And in doing so, making that war more likely, not less likely.
Now, Mark, there's been a lot of speculation about the possibility that perhaps the Americans might join in for a couple of rounds, that B-2s might be flown from Diego Garcia to drop a couple of bombs on Fordow, for example, in an attempt to essentially destroy that remaining nuclear facility that, as you say, is deep underground and requires ordnance that the Israelis simply don't have. What do you think are the chances of that? Is that something the United States should actually consider?
Look, I think it really depends on President Trump. I mean, if there's continued Israeli success, as there has been over the past 24 hours, I think he already is trying to own that success. I mean, I think in his post today, you could see already him putting his arms around that success. You know, I'm part of that success. It was U.S. military equipment. It was my support for Bibi. These are the things that he's now starting to really embrace this, despite the fact that the isolationists in his party are starting to get very, very upset with the president. I think at some point, President Trump could probably appreciate that once the Israelis have done multiple rounds and have destroyed as much as they can, this would be an historic opportunity for him to really set back Iran's nuclear weapon program, not by months or years, but maybe decades. And I think that may be the opportunity where he comes in with B-2 bombers, destroys Fordow, and gets rid of whatever remaining infrastructure the Iranians have. The other potential option, and I think this is Khamenei's smartest play, is after this humiliation, wait a week, but then actually send lead Iranian negotiator Arakchi to Oman to start negotiating with the Americans. Again, Trump has already signaled he's prepared for a deal, and he'll sit down with the Iranians and do this peacefully. He's been warning about that for months. We'll do this peacefully, or we'll do this militarily. And I think Trump was heavily engaged with Bibi in running a very well-oiled deception operation that lulled the Iranians into a false sense that the president wasn't prepared to greenlight Israeli military power. And they were literally caught, both figuratively and literally, in their beds when the Israelis launched a preemptive attack and took out, dozens of IRGC commanders and army chiefs and nuclear scientists. So Khamenei's best play, go back to the negotiations and see if he can get an offer that he can live with. Trump, I think, actually now is in a much more powerful position, both at the negotiating table and in terms of his military option to strip Iran once and for all of the capabilities it needs to build nuclear weapons.
Mark Dubowitz, Chief Executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, really appreciate the time and the insight.